You do not break all at once. You break in quiet ways, in the moments when you say yes while something inside you is begging for rest, in the nights when your body is exhausted but your mind is still carrying emotions that were never yours to keep, in the habit of being the safe place for everyone else while becoming a stranger to yourself. The deepest pain is not always what people did to you. Sometimes it is what you had to become in order to survive them. And one day, beneath all the giving, all the understanding, all the silence, you begin to wonder whether your kindness has been healing others or slowly erasing you. Welcome to Healing Minds, a place where we explore the hidden patterns of the inner world, deep sensitivity, emotional wounds, and the journey toward real healing and wholeness. If this kind of content speaks to you, please like this video and subscribe to Healing Minds for more deep and meaningful insights. There is a certain kind of person you usually do not fully understand the first time you meet them. They listen with a depth that feels unusual, almost unsettling, because they are not only hearing your words, they are noticing everything underneath them. They pick up on what you avoid saying, what you hide, and what even you may not fully recognize in yourself yet. While other people take years to understand someone's deeper nature, they often sense it within a very short time. Jungian psychology gives us one of the clearest ways to understand what lives inside people like this. What they carry is both rare and overwhelming. They form connections that feel immediate and impossible to explain, yet just as quickly, they pull away. That distance is not coldness. It comes from exhaustion, from a lifetime of taking in what other people leave behind and never learning how to shut it out. This is where the psychology of the trauma-born empath becomes most revealing. It is not simply about being caring, intuitive, or emotionally aware in the casual way people often describe online. Carl Jung approached this kind of personality with far more seriousness and much more psychological depth. After spending years exploring the structure of the unconscious, he described people whose inner sensitivity goes far beyond what ordinary social life can comfortably hold. His work suggests that only a small number of them ever truly find a path through that inner burden. Before going any further, one misunderstanding has to be cleared away. The word empath is often used as if it describes a special gift, almost something magical, a person who can easily feel what others feel. Jung's view is far more exact, grounded, and in many ways much more troubling than that simplified modern idea. In Psychological Types, published in 1921, Jung described what he called the introverted feeling type. These are people whose emotional life is not just important to them, but central to how they experience everything. Feeling is not a side note in their personality. It is the main language through which life is understood. The outer world does not reach them directly. It passes through a deep inner system first, where everything is silently measured and interpreted. Jung wrote that introverted feeling is shaped mainly by the subjective factor and makes people quiet, hard to reach, and inclined to withdraw. He compared it to a violet, shrinking back from the harshness of the world so it can preserve the depth of its own inner life. That image matters because it captures something essential. Their withdrawal is not random. It is a defense, a natural reaction to an outside world that feels too intense and too invasive. This also connects to a concept Jung borrowed from anthropology called participation mystique, a condition in which the line between self and other becomes blurred or disappears altogether. In early or primitive psychology, Jung argued there was little sense of a separate individual self. There was mainly a shared psychological field, a deep collective bond. For most people, this state fades as the ego develops and personal boundaries become stronger. But for the trauma-born empath, that boundary often remains fragile. They do not just notice the moods of others, they absorb them without choosing to. When a room is full of pressure, pain, or tension, they can carry it long after everyone else has moved on. Now imagine what happens when a child with this kind of inner structure grows up in a home where their sensitivity is mocked, ignored, or treated like a weakness instead of being understood. Imagine a home shaped by tension, where arguments are normal, emotion is treated like a flaw, and sensitivity is something people learn to hide. In that kind of environment, a deeply sensitive child is not hurt in the usual way. The pain reaches further. It becomes woven into the very system they use to relate to other people. Their gift for feeling deeply becomes tied to the same experiences that wounded them most. Jung described this kind of inner life with remarkable clarity. He wrote about the steady movement of unconscious material into conscious experience, so much so that it becomes difficult to tell what truly belongs to the person and what has risen from somewhere deeper. For the trauma-born empath, that flow rarely stops. Their inner world is always active, always processing, always taking in more than they can easily sort or separate. Because of that, the line between their own emotions and the emotional atmosphere around them often stays unclear. They feel things intensely, but they do not always know where those feelings began. Was it theirs, or did it come from the room, the relationship, the tension in someone else's silence? This is why genuine closeness can feel dangerous even when it is desired. Real connection does not simply bring comfort. It can reopen the earliest pain, the first moments when being emotionally open led to hurt rather than safety. That is one of the central mechanics of trauma-born empathy, and it is exactly the kind of inner structure Jung's work helps explain. When you meet someone who has lived with this pattern for years, what stands out first is often the contradiction. They seem to understand people almost instantly, yet somehow remain just beyond reach. They can be warm, perceptive, and deeply present, but still carry a distance that ordinary kindness cannot break through. What looks like coldness is often something far more complex. It is usually a protective system built slowly over many years, often beginning in childhood. The first layer is the persona, the social face Jung described as the mask people use to function in the world. For the trauma-born empath, that mask is often unusually thin. It does not protect them very well, and it takes enormous effort to keep it in place. Even simple social interaction can drain them because they are not just speaking or listening. They are constantly managing impressions, filtering intensity, and trying to survive in a world that rewards surface confidence while often rejecting emotional depth. Eventually, withdrawal stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the only way to recover. The second layer is made of unresolved complexes. Those emotionally charged clusters Jung saw as living forces inside the unconscious. A complex is not just a bad memory. It is an active wound that continues shaping perception, reaction, and behavior from beneath awareness. In the trauma-born empath, these wound patterns often build quickly and deeply because each painful experience lands with greater force. They do not just remember hurt, they absorb it into their psychological structure. Then, the same sensitivity that created those wounds becomes the very tool they use to navigate closeness, trust, and love. So every time they open up to someone, those old emotional patterns can awaken again. A small disappointment may touch a much older injury. A minor misunderstanding may stir a deep memory of rejection. This is why relationships feel so meaningful to them and also so exhausting. The third layer is the shadow, the part of the self that has been denied, ignored, or pushed out of conscious identity. Trauma-born empaths usually see themselves as the caring one, the understanding one, the gentle one. They are comfortable identifying with kindness, patience, and generosity. But qualities that do not match that self-image, such as anger, firmness, self-protection, ambition, or healthy aggression often get pushed aside. Jung warned that whatever is denied does not disappear. It grows in darkness. When a person refuses to recognize these rejected parts, they do not become more pure or more whole. They become divided. For the empath loner, that division often shows up as exhaustion with no obvious source. They sleep, rest, and step back, yet still feel empty. They give to others, but the giving feels like further loss instead of shared connection. What is happening underneath is a self in conflict with itself. One part wants peace and closeness. Another part is carrying unspoken anger, buried boundaries, and neglected needs. And because those shadow elements were never fully accepted, the person cannot use them in healthy ways. They may struggle to say no, to protect their energy, or to feel justified in their own frustration. This leads to one of the greatest dangers Jung repeatedly pointed to in group psychology: the tendency of families, workplaces, and relationships to unload their unspoken negativity onto the least defended person. The trauma-born empath, already used to taking responsibility for what others feel, often becomes the one who carries what no one else wants to face. Without meaning to, they become the container for the tension, guilt, resentment, and emotional waste of the group, again and again, until depletion feels like their normal state. They are usually the first to notice when something feels off, even if no one has spoken a word. They are the one quietly trying to smooth over tension, calm the room, and carry what others cannot or will not deal with. Long after everyone else has moved on, they are still awake in the middle of the night, thinking through the weight of what was left behind. People often praise them for this. They are called kind, dependable, emotionally safe, and deeply understanding. But that praise can become part of the trap. It rewards the very pattern that slowly drains them. Over time, this exhaustion sinks beneath awareness. Because it builds little by little, they often do not recognize it as a structural problem in the way they have learned to live. Instead, they blame themselves. They assume they are too weak, not disciplined enough, or somehow failing at being the strong person everyone expects them to be. Jungian psychology names this dynamic much more clearly. It is the price of carrying emotional burdens that never truly belonged to you in the first place. From there, a second danger begins to form, a distorted kind of ego inflation. Jung used that term to describe what happens when the ego becomes fused with something larger than itself and loses the right sense of proportion. Most people imagine inflation as obvious superiority, the person who believes they are uniquely important or chosen. But in the trauma-born empath, it can appear in the opposite form. It sounds more like this: I hurt more deeply than others, I carry more than others, and because of that, my suffering must mean something greater. That is the hidden structure of martyrdom. It creates a false sense of purpose that can feel noble and meaningful for years, until eventually it breaks down and leaves behind a deep emptiness. When that false meaning collapses, the person often feels lost in a way ordinary self-help language cannot reach. Another danger begins to grow there, and that is the savior complex. The empath starts to believe that their pain has prepared them to rescue, heal, or carry others in a way that gives their own suffering value. Jung's model is especially powerful here because it does not stop at behavior. It maps the deeper movement of psychic energy itself. He called this energy libido, not in the narrow sense, but as the broad life force of the psyche. This energy naturally wants to move, grow, and flow toward development, but in the trauma-born empath, that movement is blocked. The first blockage appears between the conscious ego and the personal unconscious, the layer that holds forgotten feelings, unprocessed memories, and everything once experienced but never fully understood. Inside that layer sits the emotional residue of every time their sensitivity was shamed, dismissed, or punished. Those experiences do not simply vanish. They settle into the psyche and form complexes that begin consuming energy from below awareness. The person is not only tired because life is hard, they are tired because psychic energy is constantly being spent managing old emotional material that was never fully faced. The second blockage lies in the shadow, especially the parts of themselves they have built an identity around rejecting. For the empath loner, the shadow often contains anger, self-interest, firmness, ambition, and the right to disappoint others. These qualities feel dangerous because they seem to conflict with being caring and good. But Jung and those who followed him were clear that the shadow is not only a source of darkness, it is also a source of renewal. When life feels stuck, dry, and emotionally drained, the energy needed for change is often hidden in the very parts of the self that have been pushed away. What was rejected may be exactly what needs to be reclaimed. The third blockage involves the inner bridge Jung described through the anima and animus, the psychological functions that connect the ego to the deeper layers of the unconscious. This path toward wholeness, which Jung called individuation, is never easy or comfortable. It requires facing what the personality most wants to avoid. First comes the shadow, the parts of yourself you do not want to admit are there. Then comes the encounter with what feels deeply other, what challenges your familiar identity. And beyond that lies the larger unconscious itself, which cannot be controlled by the ego's preferences. For the empath loner, the first crossing begins with a difficult truth. Their kindness is real, but it is not always pure. Mixed into their generosity, there may be fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, or fear of losing connection. That does not make their care false. It makes it human, and seeing that clearly is the beginning of real integration. True integration begins when they can admit that some of their giving has also been a strategy for safety. Some of their patience has included avoidance. Some of their selflessness has hidden the fear of what might happen if they spoke honestly or set a limit. That recognition is not a failure, it is maturity. Jungian thought does not ask a person to destroy these traits, but to see them in their full composition and begin a long inner negotiation with what has been denied. For the trauma-born empath, the next step is rebuilding the ego in a healthier way. This is where many sensitive people misunderstand growth. They assume strength means becoming harder, less open, less feeling, less affected. But Jung's psychology points in another direction. Individuation does not ask a person to lose their sensitivity. It asks them to develop enough inner structure that sensitivity no longer rules them, empties them, or leaves them defenseless in the presence of everything the world refuses to carry. It gives sensitivity a foundation strong enough to hold it without breaking under its weight. Jung suggested that neurosis often appears when a person avoids the kind of suffering that is actually necessary. For the trauma-born empath, the pain of endless giving, absorbing, and carrying others can become a substitute for something even harder: honest confrontation with the self. It is easier to keep helping, keep draining, keep staying useful than to sit still and face what is unresolved inside. But individuation asks for exactly that deeper kind of suffering. It asks a person to stop escaping into patterns that feel noble and begin turning inward with honesty. That is where the real work begins. Not in appearing healed, not in being endlessly available, but in allowing the structure of the self to be rebuilt from within, slowly and truthfully, through the discomfort of seeing what has always been there. This is why Jung placed such importance on direct engagement with the unconscious through memories, dreams, reflection, and what he called active imagination. He spoke openly about his own practice of entering into dialogue with the figures that emerged from his inner world whenever his emotions became disturbed or unsettled. He did not treat the unconscious as an abstract theory. He treated it as something living, something that required relationship. For the trauma-born empath, the same principle applies. There is no shortcut around the early wounds still charged with emotion. There is no clean escape route that avoids the shadow, the inner opposite, or the unresolved complex. The way through is the way through. And for a person of unusual inner sensitivity, trying to force themselves into ordinary emotional numbness or conventional normality becomes unbearable. It leads not to peace, but to sterility, deadness, and a life that feels empty even when it looks functional from the outside. One of the first major obstacles on this path is spiritual bypassing. The trauma-born empath often has a natural openness to spiritual states. Meditation may come easily, intuition may feel strong, altered states, inner symbols, and moments of expanded awareness may arrive with less effort than they do for others. But this gift becomes dangerous when it is used to avoid emotional work instead of support it. It becomes a refined form of escape. A person may speak beautifully about healing, consciousness, surrender, or transcendence, while never actually entering the grief, anger, fear, or shame stored in the body. Jung's psychology leaves little room for confusion here. Real transformation does not happen by floating above darkness. It happens by becoming conscious of it. You do not turn pain into wisdom by skipping over it. No method that avoids emotional truth can produce real psychological integration, no matter how elevated it sounds. The second barrier is intellectual understanding without lived integration. Many trauma-born empaths become highly knowledgeable. They read deeply. They learn the language of Jung, the shadow, the anima and animus, the complex, the false self, the savior pattern. They can explain their own dynamics with remarkable accuracy. They may even sound deeply self-aware, but nothing essential changes. Their relationships still follow the same pattern. Their body still enters the same depletion after closeness. Their nights are still interrupted by the same nameless dread. This is because understanding a wound and metabolizing it are not the same thing. One happens in the mind. The other happens through emotional contact, through the body, through returning in some form to the original pain and allowing it to be consciously felt. Jung was direct about this. Emotion is what makes consciousness possible. Without emotion, insight stays abstract. The person may possess the map in perfect detail, yet still never truly step into the territory. The third barrier is cynicism, and in many ways it is the most final. After enough disappointment, enough hurt, enough cycles of opening and feeling punished for it, the trauma-born empath may shut down completely. They build a wall around themselves and call it wisdom. They present detachment as maturity, emotional distance as strength, and disconnection as clarity. But in doing so, they lose contact with the very quality that once gave their inner world its depth and meaning. Jung understood that loneliness is not simply about being physically alone. It comes from being unable to share what matters most inside you, or from carrying truths and feelings that seem unacceptable to those around you. The answer, then, is not perfection or total invulnerability. Jung's entire psychology points instead toward wholeness. And for the trauma-born empath, that means learning to hold every part of the self together without exile. Wholeness means allowing care and anger to exist in the same person. It means holding sensitivity and boundaries together. It means being open without being self-erasing and capable of refusal without guilt. Real freedom does not come from suppressing painful emotions or covering them with language that sounds evolved. It comes from feeling them fully enough that they no longer need to control the whole personality from the shadows. Even depression, in Jung's view, is not always simply a sign of pathology. Sometimes it is the mind and soul preparing for renewal, for a shift in the personality, for the beginning of real creative life after old structures have failed. There comes a moment when the trauma-born empath has nothing left to give in the old way, no more energy for pleasing, rescuing, carrying, or dissolving into others, and that moment, empty as it feels, may actually be the threshold. At that threshold, the psyche stands stripped of its usual substitutes. The old strategies no longer work. Overgiving does not save them. Spiritual escape no longer relieves them. Cynicism no longer protects them. What remains is the self, standing before everything it has avoided for years. This is the place Jung's path ultimately leads toward. It asks a person to stay there long enough for something deeper to unfold. To resist the old reflexes, not forever, but long enough for the unconscious to complete the movement it has been trying to make all along. That movement is not toward becoming untouchable, it is toward becoming whole. And perhaps the most decisive moment in that process is the one Jung described so simply and so clearly. Learning to remain alone with your own self, not in abandonment, but in truth. There comes a point where no outer support can do the deeper work for you. You have to be alone long enough to discover what still holds you when all the usual ways of coping stop working. That is the experience Jung believed could create a foundation nothing can easily destroy. Not a foundation built on praise, usefulness, or being needed by others, but one built from the inside through real self-confrontation. This kind of strength does not appear through positive thinking or through staying endlessly busy with other people's pain. It is formed by facing what has been delayed for years, the shadow that was avoided, the wound complexes that were never fully entered, the anger pushed out because it felt dangerous, the needs denied because they seemed selfish. This is where the honest path of the trauma-born empath finally leads, not toward numbness, but toward inner solidity. What emerges there is a self that does not need to become less sensitive in order to survive. It becomes capable of feeling deeply without collapsing under what it feels. That is the real turning point. The goal is not to shut down empathy, but to become strong enough inside that empathy no longer destroys the person carrying it. When the shadow is finally recognized, it stops acting like an unseen force draining energy from below the surface. It begins to return something vital. The anger that was buried becomes boundary. The need that was denied becomes self-respect. The parts once judged as dangerous begin to serve life instead of sabotaging it. Jung understood that renewal does not come from pretending the darker parts are not there. It comes from meeting them directly. For the trauma-born empath, that meeting is not the end of who they are. It is the beginning of becoming whole enough to remain standing. In the end, this journey is not about becoming less sensitive, less caring, or less open. It is about becoming whole. It is about learning that your depth was never the problem. The real danger was carrying everything alone, silencing your anger, denying your needs, and mistaking self-abandonment for love. Healing begins when you stop treating your pain as something to hide and start seeing it as a message from the parts of you that have waited long enough. The moment you face your shadow, honor your limits, and allow yourself to feel without collapsing into what others need from you, something changes. You stop surviving through sacrifice and start living through truth. And that is where your real strength begins, not in how much you can carry, but in how fully you can stand inside yourself without disappearing. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Healing Minds, and comment renewal below so I know this message found the right soul.